Good morning, everybody. I'd like to talk about three things today. I'd like to talk about the methodology of scenario planning because we live in a world of great risk at the moment, given the terrible pandemic that we've been through. The second thing I'd like to talk about is the kind of flags that were going up before even the pandemic started, which we feel that you should be watching in terms of the global economy and where it's going. But of course, some of them have been made more intense by the pandemic. And then thirdly, I'd like to talk about South Africa and what I feel would be the best way for our economy to recover here. The story starts back in 1960. A man called Herman Kahn, who worked for the Rand Corporation in California, advising the US military, he wrote a book called On Thermonuclear War, in which he played a scenario of a full-scale conflict between the Soviet Union and America. And it wasn't a forecast, he called it a scenario. And indeed, he took that word from some of his friends who worked in Hollywood, because the summary of a movie script is called a scenario when you're trying to raise money to make the movie. And in that sense, a scenario is a movie script. And Herman wrote this incredible book about how the Soviet Union and America could have a war. And 2 years later, it actually proved an incredibly valuable exercise because that was the closest that America and the Soviet Union ever came to war over missiles in Cuba. The Americans said, you must get rid of those missiles. The Soviet Union stood its ground. And Kennedy and Khrushchev got very, very close to war. And thank heavens that Herman Kahn had written this book showing exactly the kind of destruction that would be caused if the two nations went to war. He became quite a celebrity in the United States after that, and he decided to teach scenario planning. And the person who mentored me in the field of scenario planning, a Frenchman called Pierre Wack, decided to go and learn under Herman about the technique. Pierre was a very clever man. He'd come top of his class at l'École Polytechnique in Paris. He'd actually studied at Indian ashrams, and then he decided to go and work with Herman. And during his training with Herman, he discovered something, which is it was not only good for military purposes to do scenario planning, but it could also be good in an industrial setting. So he joined Royal Dutch Shell in the early 70s and set up a scenario planning team there. And he actually wrote scenarios on the two oil price shocks that occurred in the 70s. In the early 70s, it went from $3 to $12 a barrel. And in the late 70s, it went from 12 to around $36, $37 a barrel. Nobody did anything for the oil price shock, the first oil price shock, because Pierre didn't use the right language to management. So he decided to have conversations with them about how they saw the future. And when he gave his second possible scenario of another oil price spike during the 1970s, they listened to him and they actually changed their strategy and they made a lot of money. And Pierre became a legend in London overnight. And it came to our attention as the biggest mining company in the world at the time, Anglo-American. And we thought, gosh, if it can be used in the field of oil, maybe it can be used for the kind of stuff that we produce, like gold and diamonds and copper and other things. So we asked Pierre to come to Johannesburg and give us a lecture on this technique. And I was a young man at the time. I was secretary of the Anglo Executive. And I always remember Pierre walking into our executive committee room in Johannesburg. And he bewitched us. He looked like a futurist. He had hooded eyes. He had a goatee beard. And before he spoke, he said, "Can I light up?" And we all thought he was going to light a Gauloise, being French, instead of which he produced an incense stick and lit it and said, "I think more clearly about the future when I'm smelling incense." And so we hired him on the spot, and Gavin Relly, who was the chairman of Anglo at the time, looked around the room and said, "Clem, why don't you look after this technique in addition to your mining responsibilities?" And I said, "That's absolutely fine." And so I had this wonderful relationship with Pierre Wack for about 10 years. And he brought with him a circle of remarkable people that he'd gathered in his Shell days. And so it's not an exaggeration to say that Anglo at the time had probably the best futurist team that you could assemble anywhere in the world. And they did the job. In the mid-1980s, they wrote some global scenarios on what could happen by the 1990s. And one of them was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And indeed, it happened. In 1990, the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union disappeared. They said it would happen because they couldn't afford to continue the arms race and would possibly go bankrupt. But of course, it was Mr. Gorbachev who caused the end of the Soviet Union. But the other incredible exercise they did was on South Africa, where we had two scenarios: the high road of negotiation leading to a political settlement, and the low road of confrontation leading to civil war and a wasteland. And against all expectations at the time, South Africa took the high road. And that's why scenario planning is so much better as a technique for handling the future than forecasting the future, because you could never in the mid-1980s have forecast that Nelson Mandela would be released at the beginning of 1990, and there would be negotiations towards a final political settlement and a democratic election in 1994. Even our own scenario team thought it would happen later on than it did. But that's why you do scenario planning. You capture possibilities about the future rather than trying to forecast the future. The next really big thing that happened was in 1999, I was doing a presentation and a young woman came up to me and said, "I'm doing a thesis on scenario planning. Mr. Sunter, would you mind reading my thesis?" Her name was Chantel Ilbury. And I said, "I'd love to read your thesis." And so she sent it to me, and it was brilliant. It was about how scenario planning could be applied to small business and for entrepreneurs to cope with the uncertainties of starting a business. And I said to Chantel, "We must collaborate on a book." And we wrote The Mind of a Fox, which was published in June 2001. And in it, we talked of two kinds of people, hedgehogs and foxes. We took it from a Greek poet called Archilochus, who said, "The hedgehog knows one big thing and the fox knows many little things." And we felt that this was just the way to contrast forecasters with scenario planners, because a forecaster has a single line future on which he or she bets everything, whereas a fox looks at multiple different futures, looks at the flags and sees which flags are going up and down, and then gives probabilities to the different scenarios. And that's why we called the book The Mind of a Fox. To begin with, it didn't do that well, but then something happened which overnight turned it into an enormous hit. It was the #1 selling book in South Africa of any title in 2002. And in 2003, it was #2 because Harry Potter was #1. So what was the event? The event was 9/11, because what we decided to do in the book was write a letter to George Bush, in which we said to him that part of his legacy as president would be determined by the speed with which he acted towards some of the risks that he faced. And we nominated as his #1 risk a massive terrorist strike on a Western city. And it happened 3 months after we published the book with 9/11. And when the Americans did a literature search, they found that ours was the only book published anywhere in the world at the time that in a formal letter to the president said, this could happen. Why do I know that? Because I was rung up by the US State Department, who said to me, how is it that two South Africans could actually postulate a scenario that no American intelligence agency did? And I said, actually, we didn't know it was going to happen 3 months after we published the book. It happened because we had 3 flags in mind when we said that. Number one was the growing competition between different religions in the world, particularly Islam and Christianity and Judaism, which started in the late 1980s. The second flag was the growing sophistication of terrorist movements during the 1990s. And the third flag was the 2 attacks by Al-Qaeda on American embassies in Africa, in Tanzania and Kenya in 1998, which we felt could be a dress rehearsal for the real thing in the West. And yeah, that's why it was his number one threat. It's not that we gave a date to the threat. You can't do that when you're looking at the future. You can't be that precise. As Pierre used to say, it's much better to be vaguely right than precisely wrong. And with a risk or a threat, you put it out there so that when other flags go up, you can then determine whether the threat is rising or it is falling. So since then, we have done thousands of sessions with companies around the world using this technique of looking at different scenarios for their markets, looking at different flags, which would indicate which way the markets are going, and then, of course, determining what the best strategy is to cope with the changing prospects for the market. And that, of course, has included companies that are involved in managing people's investments, pension funds, banks, and companies like that. So it is a very, very good technique. What are the flags that our clients have raised with us over the last 10 years? Well, the number one flag is still the religious flag. It's still there. It's changed. It's not so much terrorist attacks in major cities. It's what's going on in the Middle East right now, and particularly the rivalry between Saudi Arabia on the one side and Iran on the other side. And of course, in the middle, there's Israel, and everyone is concerned, of course, that Iran is about to get a nuclear weapon. And so you have to watch this because it's a lot of risk in that particular area at the moment. And America is considering rejoining the pact that Europe has with Iran not to produce nuclear weapons. And so this is very, very important in terms of the future of that particular region. The second flag we call the red flag because it covers the old communist world. The first country is Russia. And of course, Russia at the moment is under sanctions from America and from Europe because of the annexation of Crimea. And just recently, they've moved more troops and military into Crimea. Apparently, they're doing a whole bunch of exercises to the north of Russia in the Arctic Sea. And so, you know, there's still a lot of worry about Russia being a potential enemy. And then, of course, there's Mr. Navalny, who's in prison at the moment, who was poisoned. And you know, you have to worry about all these kind of things because Russia is the one country that can rival the United States in terms of nuclear weaponry. But the second country is even more important. It's China. Because China, according to one British research institute, could overtake America to become the largest economy in the world by 2028. Now that is incredible because in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping became president, it was the 100th ranked economy in the world. It's now number 2, and it could be number 1 by 2028. Now think about that. That's about 50 years. 50 years. And, to go from 100 to 1 is the biggest kind of miracle of modern humankind. And of course, it could change the world because China is so different to America. I mean, China is an autocracy. It's not a democracy. It's an autocracy. The Communist Party ruled China. I did a session at the Central Party School in Beijing in 2006, and it was interesting because I had some of the top strategic planners for the Communist Party in that particular room, because it is the leadership academy for the party. And I remember saying to them, is there any scenario where you evolve into a democracy? And one of the professors stroked his beard and said, Mr. Sunter, do you have a political opposition in Anglo-American? And I said, no. He said, well, that's how we run China. It's like a multinational company. And the reason it's important is that the West has dominated the world for the last 300 to 400 years. And now, for the very first time, for a very long time, you're going to have an Eastern country with a very different style of government in charge of the world. And we all know the problems around China. There's problems over the status of Hong Kong, Taiwan, there's the Uyghurs, and of course there's military movements in the South China Sea. And as Joe Biden, the new president of the United States, said, we do not want to go from being arch competitors to being arch enemies. And that's why this strategic relationship between America and China over the next few years, again, has to be watched very closely as a flag. The third country is North Korea. And North Korea does possess nuclear weapons. And the estimate of some people is that they've got at least 10 nukes in their armory. They've launched missiles that show that they can certainly hit Japan, if not the western coast of the United States. And Kim Jong-un is a very unpredictable leader. And yes, he cozied up to Trump, but we're not quite sure where Joe Biden is heading in terms of North Korea, because the challenge still exists, which is North Korea has not denuclearized at all in terms of the agreement that he reached with Trump. And therefore, sanctions are still being applied and the tensions are still there. And America has troops in South Korea. So, again, it's a flashpoint, this, which has to be watched, because it can certainly very quickly change prospects in the Far East. The third flag is what we call a clockwork flag. It's ticking away in the background, but it's made a huge difference to the prospect of economies around the world. We call it the gray flag of aging. And Pierre first raised it in 1988. I remember him saying, if Japan ever has a property crash, because property values in the late 80s were absurd in Japan, he said, they're never going to grow fast again. And he said, it's because they're the oldest country in the world. They have more people over 65 than any other nation on earth. And he was right. In 1990, there was a property crash in Japan, and never since 1990 has Japan grown at the rate it did in the 70s and 80s of 7 to 8% per annum. It's averaged between 0.5% and 1%. So why is this flag so important? It's important from an investment point of view, because you shouldn't invest in countries which have very slow economic growth rates. And guess what? Europe is falling into exactly that same category now of being an aging group of nations. Greece is an old country. So is Italy. In fact, in Italy, the population is declining. And to see how important this flag is, just look at what's happened to the UK stock market versus the American stock market. In December 1999, the FTSE 100, the leading index in the UK, was 6,950 at the end of that year. Guess what it is this morning? It's around 6,850. So it's lower than it was in 1999. And yes, you would have had the dividends, and the dividend yield has been pretty good in the UK recently, around about 3%. So you'd have made money on dividends, but you only if you were a trader would you have made money in the UK market over the last 20 years. But in America, which has a much younger, more resilient population, the Dow Jones Industrial Average at the end of December 1999 was 11,700. Guess what it is today? 33,000. So you would have tripled your money in America over the last 20 years, and you would have made the dividends. Obviously at a lower yield. It's not 3% in America, it's between 1% and 2% per annum, but you'd have made serious money in the United States. And obviously there are other reasons as well, but one of the principal reasons is that you have to look at the demographics of a country to see whether it is going to achieve a high economic growth rate, because old people don't buy as much, they don't innovate as much, they don't do anything as much. So you have to consider the age profile of a country before you invest in it. So it's a very important flag. And incidentally, China had a one-child policy for a long period, and now it's back to a two-child policy. But that's turned China itself into a middle-aged population, and inevitably the economic growth rate has slowed down. Yes, it's a much larger economy, but the economic growth rate of China is now in the 5 to 6% range, as opposed to the 8 to 10% range that it was 10 years ago. And one of the reasons is it has become a middle-aged population. The next flag is a dramatic flag. It's what we call a cloudy flag because it changes shape every day. And it's the anti-establishment flag, which really first went up in the 2010s after the financial crash. And it's based on the sheer inequality that exists in the world today. Because what's happened since that crash of 2008 is that the super rich have gone back to being super rich. And in fact, they've just released the kind of top 10 billionaires in the world, and 5 of them have made a huge amount of money out of the pandemic because they're involved in high tech. And so you have this yawning gap between the super rich and the middle class. We're not talking about the poor, we're talking about the middle class. And this has caused a huge amount of anger amongst ordinary citizens in many countries in the world. It led to Brexit because Boris Johnson was very clever. He took the anger of the North and he directed it at the South. He said, you know, don't listen to those guys in Westminster. We should be out of the UK, out of Europe. And indeed, he succeeded with his Brexit campaign by garnering the votes of the north of England who are angry. In America, Trump got in, even though he's a very rich person himself. He managed to put himself on the side of blue-collar workers. And he got in. And what I'm trying to say is that this flag has to be watched very carefully because we're in a very divided world at the moment. It's not just divisions between companies, which you can see with the way the vaccines have been handled, but it's divisions within countries. And of course, the thing which has really revved up this flag is social media. Social media has made this flag very, very intense. And so we now have a new fluidity in society that we've really never had before. And again, you have to watch it very carefully because we all know that there has to be a certain degree of social harmony in a country for business to prosper and the economy to grow. But I'm coming to the flag that probably is the most important over the remainder of this century, and which should certainly be in your mind when you're wondering which areas to invest in. And that is the green flag of climate change. It is huge now. I did a session about 15 years ago with some of the top climate change experts in the world, and they gave a 95% probability to human carbon emissions causing climate change. They said there's obviously a certain level of doubt, but we would say beyond reasonable guilt. The warming up of the planet is due to human carbon emissions. And this is very important, because what's happened since they said that is that the whole rate of climate change has increased to the point that now people are saying that we could be living in a vastly different world by the 2030s because of very extreme weather events, which we're already experiencing. Much more intense rainfall, much bigger droughts causing much more widespread fire in places like California and Australia. We are seeing rising sea levels, which can threaten cities like New Orleans. We're certainly seeing the melting of Greenland, and we're certainly seeing the Arctic turning into possibly another trade route because the ice will have melted. And so you have to consider what are we as a species on Earth going to do to sustain ourselves, because there's no planet B. There's no way we can just all get in a massive rocket and fly off to another planet. And so this flag is going to dominate the conversation for the rest of the century. And therefore, industries which are associated with fossil fuels are going to be under real pressure. And all those industries associated with renewable energy and trying to do something about climate change are going to be the ones in demand. This is going to be a period of real innovation in that direction, because there is a huge urgency now for that to happen. Now, people forget that we're now nearly 8 billion of us on Earth. In 1820, it was a billion, and now we're 8 billion. And we have now got to find a way of treating the Earth in a way that we all can survive. Which brings me to the two flags which I've been watching in tandem, which is the national debt flag and the pandemic flag. We actually talked about the pandemic in our letter to George Bush in The Mind of a Fox. We said that because of increased international travel, because the size of cities were growing in the world, the idea of another virus being transmitted to the extent that it becomes a pandemic had become more likely. Again, we didn't name the date which it would happen. We didn't say 2020 after you finished your career as president of the United States. We didn't know when it would happen. We just knew that the probability was higher. And certainly when the virus started spreading in Wuhan, I was very cautious about what the world could look like. But even I did not see the kind of total lockdown that we would have last year, when the streets of virtually every major city on Earth were completely empty. That came out of the blue, and is certainly the thing that has made this pandemic different to everyone that's existed. Not in terms of total deaths. I mean, we're about to reach 3 million deaths, which is awful and tragic. But in relation to the Spanish flu in the last century, it's still a pretty small pandemic. The Spanish flu killed between 50 and 100 million people. We're up to 3 million. But certainly the economic lockdown, which is linked to this pandemic, is very unique. And of course, what it's created is this this terrible situation of small businesses and ordinary people being in real economic misery, which is why most governments in the world have resorted to monetary relief in order to help those countries. And I've forgotten what the last figure was for the world, but it's somewhere of the order of 10 to 15 trillion dollars worth of relief packages around the world have been put in place, including something like 8 to 10 trillion dollars in the United States. And this has meant that the national debt to GDP ratio of most countries is now going through the roof. I mean, in America, it's more than 100% of GDP, national debt. I think it's around 23 trillion, whereas the US GDP is around 21. And it hasn't been like that, 100% of GDP, since 1942 during the Second World War. And the same is happening in Europe. We've just heard that Australia has hit a record percentage, national debt to GDP. And whilst interest rates are very low, everything's fine because that debt doesn't cost the governments that have it that much. But if inflation rises, then it's going to be a different story because interest rates then have to go up. And then, of course, it's going to be much more expensive to service that debt. So again, you talk to Nobel Prize-winning economists, see them on TV, and they all say it's better to have got through this economic disaster and given relief and take the risk of inflation rather than not doing anything at all. And I would agree with them. And some of them even say inflation is still not a real threat in the world. But there are others who say it is. And that's why you've got to weigh up this particular flag. And it's why cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin have gone up to, close to $60,000. And it's why gold has not done that badly either, is because people are just a little bit worried about currencies in relation to this flag of national debt. Now, what are the kind of scenarios that could play out as a result of these flags? Well, I'd like to quote the ones that we quoted to Bush in our letter to Bush. We had the gilded cage, where the rich countries kind of go into a cage and they put kind of boundaries around themselves because they don't want migrants from other countries pouring in, either as climate refugees or just refugees from war. And so they turn themselves into gilded cages. And we said to Bush, this won't work. It won't work in the long run because, unfortunately, if you have a two-speed world, you're going to be dragged down in that kind of world. But unfortunately, it is still there, the gilded cage scenario. The alternative is friendly planet, which is where people start working together to create a better world. And boy, oh boy, do we need that now for climate change. China and America have actually got to get together as the two largest carbon emitters in the world and say, what are we going to do to stop this disaster? Instead of which they're further apart now than they have been for a long time. But it is a very, very important scenario, this, and equally for us in Africa and the rest of the world. The friendly planet scenario is the one where we have a broad recovery from the pandemic, as opposed to just the rich countries having a recovery because they've all been vaccinated and they have green passports to each other, and the poor countries have to sort of stand aside in the rest of the world. So it's a very important scenario, friendly planet. And I guess at the moment, we're in gilded cage. I would give the balance of probabilities to it's a tough world out there. It's a kind of gilded cage scenario, but who knows? Maybe Joe Biden and others will see enough sense to say we now have to create a friendlier planet. Which brings me to South Africa. There's one very important flag for us when we look at our own future, which is the flag about work. It has changed completely from the last century. When I went looking for a job in the 1960s, big businesses like Anglo-American mining companies, industrial companies were all offering hundreds of thousands of jobs. But then along came automation, artificial intelligence, robots, and all those kind of things. And it has had a profound impact on the market to the extent that most of the jobs today are being created by small and micro business. A recent statistic in the United States is that at least 2/3 of the jobs being created in that economy are in the small business sector. And that's why they, before the pandemic started, had one of the lowest unemployment rates in the world, around about 4%, even lower, I think, compared to 6 to 7% in Europe. And we've got to understand this flag because we have one of the worst unemployment rates in the world at the moment, over 30%, and among young people, over 50%. If we want to revive our economy in a way that it really does become an inclusive economy, then we've got to take note of this flag and put a huge emphasis on creating an entrepreneurial revolution in South Africa. In 2016, in February, and you can watch this debate on YouTube, it's had more than 2 million hits, I debated Julius Malema at the Cape Sun. And it was an interesting debate because I said, Julius, I'm as much of an economic freedom fighter as you are. It's just that our definition of economic freedom is different. You want to nationalize the land and the banks and the mines. I don't think that will add one single degree to economic freedom. What is needed is a much more open economy and much more support for young entrepreneurs in the townships and rural areas everywhere, so that we create new businesses. Because the only way you're going to create jobs now in this world that we live in is by creating new businesses. And therefore, everybody has to play their part in a ground-up revolution to help entrepreneurs. We've had an initiative in Anglo called Zimeli, where from the 90s onwards, we've looked at places underground where you can manufacture things by small business. And then we put out contracts and we've actually helped those companies. And some of them have done extremely well, not only with us, but they've taken on other clients as well. Every large business in this country should be starting to do that. We should have e-stock exchanges in every single major city, like eBay. You can actually get public funding for your business by going to an e-stock exchange. We should have micro lending bank, like they have in Bangladesh, where all the banks get together and put together a proper micro lending bank. We've got to ease all the bureaucratic regulations around small business, to the point that I feel that the current advisory group that the president has assembled to cope with the coronavirus should actually be extended, because it has the CEOs of some of the best companies in South Africa, and they should all put their mind to how you can create this much more participative economy, because that will extend the high road. We always said there were two crossroads. The first was the political crossroads, where we had to negotiate a proper settlement with the real leaders of South Africa, and that happened. But we always said that is not enough. There's a second crossroads 20 or 30 years down the road, where if we don't have the right economic policies in place to create a participative, inclusive economy, then we're going to undo all the political progress we made. And in a sense, this pandemic has thrown that into sharp relief, because we don't have the money that we used to have, and we've got to do something about it. It's a real tipping point at the moment, and that's why this flag around the changing nature of work is so important. So I hope I've given you some views which you can use, particularly when you invest your own wealth and savings. You know, a fox is naturally a diversive a diversified person. You know, that you don't bet like a hedgehog on a single asset class or a single country or a single anything. You diversify your wealth across different categories, and you have a diversified geographical footprint at the same time. You're not going to make as much money as a hedgehog who has bet on exactly the right thing to do. But in the long run, you're going to do better than somebody who actually made a bet on the wrong class of investment or the wrong nation. You have to be diversified. So I hope that I've given you a few flags to think about for the future. I hope I've given you a methodology to use when considering your own future in terms of looking at the flags, considering the different scenarios, and then coming up with what you think is the best alternative at the moment. And of course, then watching the flags to see whether you were right or not. It's a dynamic process looking at the future. You don't just make a decision and walk away. It's a dynamic process, and I hope I've done that. And then I hope that I've given you a feel for what the best formula is for South Africa to recover from the pandemic. And I'd like to end with a benediction for all of you who've been listening to me. May the fox be with you. Thank you very much.